On his birthday, my son turned to me and said, "You can watch, but don't touch anything. You're not part of this anymore." He didn't even look me in the eye. He just pointed to an old rusted go-kart near the trash bins. "Sit over there. That one's more your speed." It was like being erased, slowly, deliberately, and with a smile. I hadn't been invited in years. Not to birthdays, not to holidays, not even to Sunday barbecues. Ever since he took over the track, the one I built from the ground up, he acted like I was some retired handyman who'd outlived his usefulness. But this year was different. It wasn't my son who called. It was my grandson. "Grandpa," he said, "come watch us race, please." His voice cracked with excitement, not judgment, so I said yes. I showed up early, parked down the hill to make room for the others. I walked past the same gates I once installed with my bare hands. Every corner still smelled like grease, sun, and gasoline, memories soaked into the concrete. Birthday banners hung from the clubhouse beams. Children laughed, holding balloons shaped like tires. Parents sipped coffee while the new carts, sleek, painted, soulless, lined up for inspection. And then I saw him, my son, polished shoes, sunglasses, clipboard in hand like he was managing a Formula One event. He didn't say hello. He didn't say thanks for coming. He didn't say Dad. He nodded at the old go-kart parked next to the trash bins. Its wheels sagged. The paint was chipped. One tire was nearly flat. He smirked. "Here, this one's yours, right? From back in your day." People nearby chuckled. No one stopped him. And then came the final touch. He handed me a folding chair. "You can watch from there. Just don't get in the way, all right?" I took the chair. I sat in silence beside the rusted cart that still carried pieces of my fingerprint in its frame. And I watched. The track roared with life. Engines screaming, kids yelling, parents clapping. No one noticed me, except one little boy, my grandson, who waved at me from the lineup, his helmet too big, his smile too honest. That's why I stayed. Not for my son, not for redemption, but for the boy who still believed the old man in the shadows meant something. And as I looked down at the broken cart beside me, I felt it again. That ache in the hands, that hunger in the chest. Because once upon a time, this place was me. They didn't know it yet, but they were racing on my bones. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Please tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? Your stories matter too. And if this story touches something in you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone. That's how you help us grow and keep these stories alive. Now, let's continue. The cart beside me groaned with age. Rust traced every joint like scars on old skin. One of the rear tires had sunken into the dirt, the steering wheel loose and wobbling. Dust coated the seat in a soft gray film, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Maybe it hadn't. A few of the younger parents walked by, laughing just loud enough. "Don't let the old man near the fast ones," someone said. Another replied, "He'd throw his back out just pulling the throttle." Their laughter wasn't cruel. No, cruelty would have at least acknowledged me. This was worse. This was dismissal, a slow erasure. They didn't hate me. They simply didn't believe I ever mattered. But the truth? That dented frame beside me, I welded it. I still remember the night. It was after a long shift. The shop was cold, and my fingers bled from gripping metal too tightly. But I had a vision, a dream that children could race with joy, that families could gather under the sun, that this forgotten stretch of land could become a place where speed met love. I poured my youth into every turn of this track. Every curve, I shaped it myself. I mapped the loops with nothing but chalk lines and instinct. I spent nights laying asphalt when the stars were the only ones watching. I tested every cart by hand, tuning engines with borrowed parts and secondhand tools. And now? The kids who race today, they didn't know. The parents sipping coffee, they didn't ask. Even my own son stood at the center of the event, shaking hands like a king, his tie too tight, his smile too polished. He never once pointed to me, never once said, "That's the man who built this." But the track knew. It remembered. Each echoing engine, each streak of rubber on concrete, was like a heartbeat, one I'd helped give life to. And though I sat there with the rusted skeleton of a forgotten cart beside me, I didn't feel shame. I felt grief. Grief not for what was taken from me, but for what they were too blind to see. This wasn't just metal and fuel. This was memory. Legacy. Sacrifice molded into speed. But maybe someone would remember. Maybe not today. maybe not even tomorrow. But one day someone would ask, who built this? And when they looked deeper, past the polished brochures and photoshopped banners, they'd find me, buried beneath the asphalt, still holding the wrench. Engines screamed past me in sharp, youthful waves. Laughter danced on the wind, high and free, carried by children who had no idea whose hands had carved the very road they raced on. I sat still, so still I almost disappeared. The old cart beside me creaked when a gust of wind nudged it. Its chain clinked softly, like it remembered being alive once, like it remembered when my hands turned its bolts, when my breath fogged up the visor as I tested it before dawn, when every part had a purpose and a story. But now it was a prop, a relic meant to sit in the background like me, visible but meaningless. I watched them zip around the curves, carts with bright decals and polished frames, smooth and fast, but not soulful, not like the ones I once built from scrap and dreams. Not a single child looked at the edges of the track, the slight rise before turn 3 that I built deliberately to make the corner more thrilling. Not one noticed the faded initials near the base of the start line. Mine, etched there decades ago with a pocket knife in a quiet act of pride. They didn't see it. Why would they? They didn't know to look. My son stood near the pit lane, grinning, confident. His hand rested on the newest model, the so-called Phantom X. Sleek, flashy, designed for show, not feel. I overheard him speaking to a guest, someone in a blazer and sunglasses who clearly had money to spend. My design? He said with a casual toss of the hand. We've come a long way. My chest tightened, not from jealousy, not even from anger, but from the ache of vanishing, of being buried while still breathing, because I remembered the blueprint he used, the sketches he found in my old garage drawer when he was 16. The frame he redesigned was just a slightly tweaked version of the one I had tested in '97, the one I nearly broke my ribs driving too hard into the turn. And there he stood, my son, wrapping his fingers around my legacy like it was his birthright. As if I hadn't worked 2 jobs to build that first prototype. As if I hadn't sold my watch, my father's watch, to buy the parts. As if he didn't ride beside me every weekend, learning how the engine hums when it trusts you. I reached for the key around my neck. It was old, worn smooth, the last piece of the first ignition I ever built. I clutched it like a memory, trying not to slip. They say legacy lives in your children. But sometimes legacy is stolen by them instead. And as the engines roared and the crowd cheered, I sat quietly, unnoticed. The man who built everything, watching the world he gave, forget him. The clubhouse smelled like coffee, engine oil, and laminated pride. I stepped inside only because my legs needed rest, but I wasn't ready for what I saw. Along the far wall, framed photographs lined up like soldiers. Crisp, glossy images of the track bathed in golden light. Children in helmets smiling mid-race. Winners holding trophies I designed on podiums I once cut from plywood in my garage. But front and center, in nearly every photo, was his face. My son, smiling, shaking hands, holding checkered flags. One hand always pointing to the future, the other buried deep in his pocket, like he had nothing to do with the sweat that built this place. Yet he stood like a founder, like a man who sacrificed for this dream. I walked slowly along the wall. Each image felt like a soft blow, not because I wasn't in them, no, I'd long given up on that, but because I was erased completely. And then I saw it, a polished brass plaque, proudly bolted beneath the largest photo. Track built by Carson Engineering. I stopped breathing for a moment. That's my name. My name. I started Carson Engineering out of a shed. No funding. Just grit. Just nights I couldn't afford to sleep because someone had to finish the wiring. Just months where I skipped meals so my son could have enough to race. I named the company after us, after him, because I believed we were building something together. But there, under that plaque, the truth had been twisted into a clean illusion. Carson Engineering still existed, but I no longer did. The brochures stacked neatly on the welcome desk had his photo on the cover, posing with a helmet tucked under his arm, a slogan beneath, the vision behind the velocity. I felt the words crawl down my spine like ice. He hadn't just claimed the track, he'd claimed the story, the pain, the joy, the long nights of failure, the breakthroughs, the broken tools, the sound of the first successful lap echoing through the dusk. He took it all and made it his, and the world applauded. Guests smiled at him like he was a pioneer. They shook his hand, took selfies beside the track, praised his ingenuity, while my name hung silently in the corner like a tombstone. I didn't speak, didn't correct anyone. What would it change? In their eyes, the man in the photos was the founder, and the old man in the corner, he was just part of the furniture, a shadow among trophies, a relic beside rust. The grand illusion was perfect. The legacy I gave, he wore like a tailored suit, and the suit fit so well, no one dared ask who stitched it. The sun had started its slow descent, casting long shadows across the track, turning the smooth asphalt into ribbons of fading gold. Laughter still rang in the distance, children squealing as they raced, unaware of the bones buried beneath the very ground they spun across. I had wandered back toward the maintenance shed. It wasn't intentional. My feet led me there like a ghost returning to its place of death. The old shed hadn't changed much. Same peeling paint, same dented toolbox I once banged shut in frustration when parts didn't fit, when money ran out, when the vision seemed too big for the man holding it. It was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had just grown tired enough to seem bigger. I stood at the edge of it, not daring to cross the threshold. Not anymore. And that's when I heard it. A voice, rough, coated in years of grease and gravel. "Mr. Carson?" I turned slowly. An old man stood just behind me. Gray cap, faded overalls, a rag stuffed into his back pocket. But his eyes still had the fire of someone who remembered. He looked stunned, almost reverent. "Mr. Carson," he repeated, "it's really you." And then softer, like something sacred. "You built this place. You are this place." I hadn't heard my name spoken like that in years. Not with respect, not with memory, not with truth. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. 1,000 words jammed in my throat, but none made it out. So I just shook my head gently. "Not anymore," I said. It came out quieter than I intended. He didn't argue. He didn't need to, because his silence said more than any applause ever could. And yet, even as I turned away, his words followed me like a heartbeat. "You built this place. You are this place." They echoed louder than the engines, louder than the announcements, the laughter, the music blaring through rented speakers. They rang somewhere deeper, somewhere real. I walked away slowly, hands in my pockets, past parents who didn't know my name and kids who didn't care. But in my palm I felt the old key again, still hanging from my neck, still warm from my grip. And suddenly, it didn't feel like a relic anymore. It felt like proof. Because while the track had forgotten, and the photos had erased, and my own blood had rewritten the story, someone remembered. Not just the man, but the making, the nights of blistered fingers, the sparks that lit up the cold workshop floor, the blueprints stained with sweat and hope. It didn't make it right. It didn't undo the theft. But in that moment, it gave me something no plaque ever had: presence. And sometimes even a whisper from the past is louder than 1,000 lies from the present. I drifted toward the VIP tent, where sleek chairs and polished tables stood in stark contrast to the grit I once embraced. There my son leaned across a mahogany table, cufflinks catching the late afternoon sun, spilling his story to a circle of nodding investors. Their faces were eager, hungry for the next big thing, his next blueprint, his next pitch. I listened from the edge of the tent, heart pounding like a starter engine. "I built it all from scratch," he said, voice smooth as varnish. "My old man was just a hobbyist." A polite laugh swept around the table, like the hiss of air escaping a tire. They bought it. They believed every word. They saw him as the mastermind, the visionary entrepreneur. I saw the crane beams I hauled, the oil stains on my shirt, the nights I squinted at blueprints until the paper blurred. I saw the blister under my thumb from tightening that stubborn bolt on the first chassis. I saw the wrench I dropped in triumph when the engine finally purred. He called me the kind of man who dreamed small, and I felt every fiber of my being twist with betrayal. My dreams had filled the night sky, each spark from the welding torch a star in a universe I built with my hands. Yet here he stood, trimming that universe down to his own silhouette, erasing the constellations I'd formed. I remembered the smell of hot metal, the roar of the first test lap, the way the asphalt had felt under my feet like a promise. Promises broken now, tears unwelcome and hot, pricked behind my eyes, but I swallowed them. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me undone. Instead, I clenched the old key against my chest, letting the cool metal anchor me to the truth no investor pitch could buy. My blood had mixed with the oil. My sweat had seeped into the concrete. My scars were etched into every turn of the track. And though he rewrote our history with false words, he could not rewrite what I carried inside me. He could not hollow out the memories of my hands molding steel and tar. He could not silence the hum of engines that still carried my heartbeat. So I stood there quietly, a ghost among the living, watching him sell my soul like a commodity. And in the silence between his laughter and their applause, I felt something burn brighter than betrayal. I felt resolve. Because while he controlled the narrative for now, he could never control the truth, laid down in every rivet, every curve, every late-night test run. And one day he would have to face the legacy he tried to bury, and the man who built it. My grandson's small hand on my sleeve felt like a lifeline. The roar of engines faded into the background as I followed him to the pit row, where his cart sat, its paint dulled by dirt, its engine coughing on every turn. He pressed his palm against the metal frame, face scrunched in worry. "Grandpa, can you fix it? It's slow." His faith in me burned brighter than the afternoon sun. I knelt beside the machine, fingers trembling not from age but from the weight of that simple request. I knelt beside the machine, fingers steadying as they brushed away the grime. I hadn't tuned an engine in years, but muscle memory took over. The soft click of the bolt as it turned, the gentle pull on the cable until it snapped into place. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple, mingling with grease smudges on my cheek. My heart hammered against ribs that had grown brittle with time, but my hands moved with the confidence of a younger man who believed in his own strength. When I finally turned the key, the engine sprang to life with a smoothness that surprised even me. It purred low and true, awakening the spirit that had rested too long in the shadows. I leaned back on my heels, chest expanding with a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. His eyes widened like I'd given him a miracle. The world paused for that moment. Laughter ceased, engines quieted, and the sun seemed to shine a spotlight on that tiny figure who saw more than everyone else. "You really know how to do this?" he asked, voice trembling between hope and awe. "I used to," I said, but the truth was deeper. I still did. Because despite every stolen photo, every congratulatory plaque that bore another name, the knowledge was mine, etched into my very bones, carried in calluses long faded. He threw his arms around me, and I felt the burden lift just enough to breathe again. In his embrace, I wasn't forgotten. I was more than a fixture on the sidelines. I was a maker, a healer, a grandfather who still held the power to bring life back to cold metal. And as he climbed into his cart, eyes shining behind his helmet, I knew that for him, my youngest witness, the story was not yet written. It was only beginning. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges as the final race of the evening lined up. The track thrummed with anticipation, helmets glinting beneath floodlights, engines ticking as they cooled from the day's heat. One cart remained behind the starting line, battered and silent, the old one. Its paint was chipped, its tires worn thin, but to me it was more alive than any polished machine. I felt a tug at my sleeve and looked down to see my grandson's eager eyes shining through the mesh of his helmet. He pointed at me with the earnest conviction only a child can muster. The crowd hushed in that moment. A collective breath held. He pleaded without words, "Let Grandpa ride. Let him show us." My son stood nearby, arms folded, the caricature of confidence. For a heartbeat, I saw the old man I once was reflected in his smirk, one of doubt, of cruelty disguised as humor. He finally nodded, voice low and dismissive. "Sure. Let the past embarrass itself." That single sentence landed like a gauntlet thrown at my feet. The world blurred, noise receding, until all I could hear was the ghost of my own heartbeat. I rose, every joint protesting. each step heavy with memories. The nights I stayed late to weld frames, the mornings I tested prototypes before dawn, the countless times I wiped sweat and tears from my brow and whispered to myself that this would be worth it someday. Climbing into the old cart, I felt its frame hug me like an old friend. My hands found the wheel as if by instinct, fingers tracing the grooves I once etched. The throttle felt warm underneath my palm, humming with latent power. Around me, children shifted in their seats. Parents leaned forward, and even my son's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. When the flag dropped, the unexpected roar of that creaking engine filled the air like a battle cry. The cart surged forward, carrying not just metal and spark plugs, but decades of hope and heartbreak. With each turn, I carved my story back into the track, every bend a testament to nights of sacrifice, every straightaway a reminder of dreams too big to be buried. As I crossed the finish line, dust trailing like a halo, the crowd erupted in stunned cheers. And in that thunderous moment, I realized that the true challenge wasn't to prove my worth to them, it was to reclaim the truth of who I'd always been. I climbed in, heart hammering against ribs that had grown weary with time. The cracked vinyl of the seat pressed against my back, familiar contours molded by my own shape from years ago. My hands hovered over the steering wheel, fingertips ghosting over the worn grooves, each ridge a memory of nights spent tweaking its balance, calibrating its response, coaxing raw metal into something that could dance. Around me, the track pulsed with expectation. Engines revving like restless beasts, young faces behind helmets locked onto me as if I were both anomaly and legend. For a moment, the world held its breath. They expected a show, an old man creaking through turns, destined to sputter and stall. But this wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming a piece of myself long buried under gloss and trophies with someone else's name. As the starter waved the flag, I felt the vibrations of the track beneath my seat, the asphalt humming with echoes of my footsteps, the residue of every step I took to build it. When I pressed the throttle, the engine responded with a deep growl, less refined than the newer carts, but richer, fuller, as if it carried my very soul in its roar. I leaned into the first corner, hands steady, vision sharp. The curve remembered me. It bent under my will, guiding the cart in a smooth arc. Each subsequent turn was a conversation between man and machine, a conversation only we understood. Behind me, the polished racers roared past at first, but then faltered on the bend where I held my line with the grace of long muscle memory. The wind whipped against my helmet, carrying the scent of rubber and possibility. In that moment, I felt every bolt I tightened, every sleepless night I spent soldering wires and mapping routes, every silent prayer that this dream wouldn't die. As I crossed the midpoint of the track, cheers erupted, not mockery but astonishment. I wasn't a spectacle, I was a reclaiming. My grandson's eyes shone above the barrier, reflection of pride and wonder mingled in his gaze. My son's face paled as he watched the ghost of his past surge ahead with undimmed power. I wasn't here to win. I was here to remember who I was, and for the first time in years, I felt whole again. The green flag dropped like a verdict, and in that instant the world narrowed to two things: my hands on the wheel and the ribbon of asphalt unfolding before me. The engine roared to life under my grip, a familiar song that surged through every joint and sinew. The cart surged forward, wheels biting into the track as if remembering the countless laps we'd shared in quieter days. Every bump felt like an old friend tapping my shoulder. Every turn beckoned me with a whisper of the nights I spent alone in the glow of my work lamp, fine-tuning each curve until it sang. I leaned into the first bend, nerves alight, sensing the precise moment the cart would drift, and then guiding it through with the soft touch of muscle memory. Behind me, new machines lurched, their drivers' eyes widening as they tried to follow the rhythm only I could hear. As I rounded the second hairpin, I spotted my grandson at the barrier, his small fist raised, a roar of encouragement drowning out the engine's growl. I felt his belief push me forward, a current stronger than any fuel. In that blur of motion, the track revealed its secrets. The subtle crown in the straightaway's center, the hidden dip before turn 3 that could throw you off balance, the slight camber on the final bend that, when respected, carried you faster than fear. They called it a challenge. I called it home. Whispers rippled through the crowd, first muted curiosity, then astonished gasps, as the old cart seemed to fly, its rusty frame holding together not by metal alone, but by decades of devotion. Parents pointed, children pressed against fences. Even my son, standing tall with his polished suit, felt the ground shift beneath his certainty. Every heartbeat matched the engine's thrum until they became one, my pulse echoing through the chassis, fueling every ounce of speed. When I crossed the line, dust trailing like a cloak of triumph, the roar that greeted me was a thunderstorm of surprise and admiration. The cart shuddered to a halt, but inside me, something ignited. In that moment, the truth curved through the air like a checkered flag. You cannot steal someone's passion, their art, or the silent hours they spent crafting a dream. No brochure, no plaque, no smug investor could erase the bond between builder and track. I had remembered who I was, an architect of joy, a sculptor of motion, a man whose legacy lay not in words, but in steel and spirit. And as the echoes of applause faded into the evening sky, I realized the old cart had flown not because it was forgotten, but because it carried the soul of its maker. I coasted across the finish line in a gentle arc, the old cart whispering against the track, as if it too felt the victory. There was no triumphant shout from me, only a deep, serene exhale that settled into my bones. I looked up to see children jumping and clapping, their helmets bobbing like bright flowers in bloom. Parents froze mid-cheer, mouths parted in awe, as if the world had paused to witness something impossible, the quiet resurrection of a forgotten dream. My son's triumphant grin wavered and cracked, like a mirror splintering under pressure. He swallowed hard, his chest tightening as though he'd lost the very breath that once fueled his boasts. I caught his eye for a fleeting heartbeat, and in that instant I saw the story shift. The polished tower he'd built on borrowed blueprints trembled at the foundation, as everyone realized the true creator had never left the scene. He'd simply been waiting for the right moment to remind them. Over the loudspeakers, the announcer's voice cut through the stunned hush, low and reverent. That was art. His single word hovered in the air, heavy with meaning. Art wasn't just painted canvases or sculpted stone. It was the alchemy of metal and human will, of late nights and broken tools, of a man's heartbeat echoing through the roar of engines. And as applause finally rose like a tide, I felt something swell inside me that years of erasure could never touch. Validation. Not for the win, but for the life I'd poured into every bolt and curve. This was more than a race. It was proof that legacy isn't given on polished brochures or golden plaques, but earned in silent determination and relentless love. And tonight, in the glow of floodlights and the echo of real praise, my legacy was in motion, alive, undeniable, and finally seen. I led him away from the clamor of engines and triumphant shouts, back to the quiet of the pit row, where grease-stained walls bore witness to countless battles of man versus machine. My grandson's helmet lay on the ground, the visor dusty with track grit. He looked up at me, eyes wide with wonder and a trace of something new, confusion, maybe even hurt. Did you really build it all? I didn't answer. Words felt too small, too clumsy to carry the weight of decades. Instead, I reached into my shirt pocket and withdrew a photograph, its edges frayed from years of handling. The image showed a younger version of myself, face slick with sweat, hair matted with oil, kneeling in a cloud of dust as I spread fresh asphalt with a trowel. Behind me, the track lay flat and bare, waiting for life. I handed it to him. His small fingers trembled as they traced the outlines of my silhouette, lingering over the dark stains that told stories no brochure ever would. For a moment, he was still, like he could hear the echo of that first lap reverberating through the years. Around us, mechanics tightened bolts and replaced spark plugs, but the world seemed to hold its breath. Finally, his voice broke the hush, soft as a whisper. They never told me. His words hung between us, heavy with truth. And in that pause, I realized the greatest victory wasn't the race I'd won under the floodlights. It was the moment a child learned the real story. Inevitably, the track would roar back to life. Engines would scream, and the crowd would cheer again. But here, in the silence broken by a grandson's wonder, I felt more seen than any finish line crowd could ever make me feel. As word spread of the old man's triumph, whispers rippled through the VIP tent and boardrooms alike. Investors who once praised my son's visionary leadership furrowed their brows over coffee-stained napkins. "Where's the original founder?" one asked, voice tight with curiosity. Another rifled through brochures, scanning for the man who built their golden goose in the first place. Overnight, grainy photographs surfaced. Me in a stained t-shirt, crouched beside a steaming trowel, me bent over a welding rig, sparks dancing like fireflies. Social media lit up with side-by-side comparisons. Childhood snapshots of my son riding my prototypes contrasted with my older, grease-smudged face in front of freshly paved asphalt. Every like and share was a small reclamation of the truth. Then came the broadcast, a half-minute segment narrated in a tone both awed and apologetic. The unsung builder of the beloved Carson track has finally been recognized, the reporter intoned as footage played of me clutching that old ignition key. For years, his sweat and skill laid the foundation for every twist and turn. Tonight, his story finally meets the light. I watched it on a borrowed tablet, seated beside my grandson under the waning glow of the evening tent lights. The crowd cheered on screen, but my heart fluttered for a different reason. My son, who'd once spun tales of my irrelevance, sat in the corner of the frame, lips pressed so tightly I could see the tension in his jaw. When the camera panned back to me, his shoulders slumped, and he went utterly silent. I felt no triumph in his discomfort. Instead, a tender pity rose in my chest. For years he had worn my legacy like an ill-fitting coat, believing that by donning it, he could eclipse the man who made it. But truth has a way of bending around lies, and in that moment, I saw him finally face the shadow he had cast over our family's name. The world was waking up to what I'd known all along, that every roar of the engines, every cheer of the crowd, every ribbon of asphalt was born from my hands and heart. It wasn't just a track, it was my life. And as the credits rolled on the news segment, I held my grandson's hand. In his wide-eyed gaze, I saw the real victory. Not vindication, but the restoration of honor. Etched not in plaques or press releases, but in the warm certainty that my work would never again be forgotten. The next weekend, the evening sun hung low like a promise, as I found myself led to the microphone stand at center track, an honor I never imagined I'd receive. The roar of engines faded into a hush as faces turned toward me. Children with dirt-smudged faces, parents holding phones aloft, and there in the front row, my son, his expression unreadable. My hands trembled as I took the mic, the weight of all those years settling into my bones. My hands may be old now, I began, voice raw yet steady, but once they shaped this joy. My throat tightened as memories flooded me, the sting of sparks on my skin, the late nights spent alone with glowing welds, the first tentative lap that told me this dream could breathe. I paused, letting the silence cradle the moment before the words came tumbling out. And while I was forgotten, the track remembered me. A single breath passed, then another, and in that pregnant pause I saw tears welling in children's eyes, saw parents wipe their cheeks, saw my grandson squeeze my sleeve with pride. I glanced at my son, his jaw loosened, gaze fixed, as if he'd only just recognized the man he sat beside all these years. The first tear slipped down his cheek, and I realized the speech I thought wasn't planned was exactly the reckoning we all needed. Applause erupted. Tent shaking, thunderous, genuine, rising like the chorus of every engine I'd ever ignited. Even my son stood, uncertain at first, then clapping until his hands ached, as if he were clapping away the ghosts of our past and welcoming the truth back into our family's heart. In that roaring wave of sound, amid the echoes of gratitude and reclaimed honor, I felt something stronger than victory. I felt home. The crowd had dwindled to echoes and footprints, the floodlights dimming one by one until only the fading glow of sunset remained. I sat in the driver's seat of the old cart, hands resting on the wheel as if saying goodbye to an old friend. My grandson climbed in beside me, careful not to scrape his helmet against the chipped paint. We sat in silence for a heartbeat, the world narrowing to the two of us, and the living canvas of asphalt that stretched before our eyes. He turned, small and earnest, and asked, "Teach me." His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of everything we just lived through. Teach me, not about speed or glory, but about the meaning behind the roar, the honor buried in each bolt, the respect woven into every ribbon of track. I lifted my gaze to the curves I once etched by hand, to the subtle rise before the turn that made hearts skip. I breathed deeply, smelling the night air spiked with rubber and possibility, and I understood then that every late night alone in the workshop, every blistered knuckle and sleepless dawn, had led to this moment, the passing of a torch more precious than any trophy. I leaned closer, voice husky with emotion. "Legacy," I whispered, "isn't in plaques or headlines." My words drifted across the cart like a benediction. "It's in the hands that build and the hearts that remember." He watched me, eyes shining brighter than the first star overhead, and slowly pressed his small hand into mine. His grip was gentle, yet it felt like a lifeline stretching through time, binding past to future, father to son to grandson. The sun dipped below the horizon in one final blaze of gold, as if heralding the end of an era and the start of a new one. In that quiet, radiant moment, I realized the real victory wasn't the race I'd won under floodlights, nor was it the applause that followed. It was this, the trust in a child's question, the continuity of a dream handed down, and the unbreakable bond forged in steel, sweat, and love. And as darkness settled in, the old cart beside me and my grandson's hand in mine, I felt more victorious than I ever had on any podium. Because some victories don't end with a flag. They begin with a spark that passes from one heart to another, carried forward by those who choose to remember.